November the 18th, 1942. The endless steppe outside Stalingrad stretched before Colonel Mikhail Petrov like a frozen desert, the temperature having plummeted to 20 degrees below zero. Snow whipped across the barren landscape as his reconnaissance unit crouched behind a collapsed farmhouse, observing German supply lines with quiet determination. They were certain the intelligence they gathered today would help tighten the noose around the Sixth Army. None of them could have imagined that a small wooden crate would change their understanding of why they might actually win this war. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the story of how a simple can of meat revealed the vast industrial gulf between superpowers, and how the realization of American production capacity transformed Soviet military thinking more profoundly than any battle could have. The wind howled across the steppe, carrying with it the distant rumble of artillery fire from the Stalingrad perimeter. Colonel Petrov adjusted his frozen binoculars, focusing on the German convoy struggling through the snow. His reconnaissance unit had been tracking Wehrmacht supply movements for 3 days now, sleeping in shifts and surviving on hard bread and whatever scraps of rations remained in their packs. His stomach growled painfully as he watched through the lens. "Comrade Colonel," whispered Senior Lieutenant Alexei Baranov, crawling forward on his elbows. "Look there, the lead truck is stuck. They're unloading supplies to lighten it." Petrov nodded grimly, his beard crusted with ice. "Good. Their misfortune is our opportunity. Perhaps today we eat better than yesterday." Beside him, political officer Ivan Rodimtsev made a disapproving sound. "We are here to gather intelligence, Comrade Colonel, not to steal food like common thieves." "Intelligence comes in many forms, Comrade Commissar," Petrov replied evenly. "The contents of their supply trucks tell us much about German capacity, and my men cannot fight on empty stomachs." Rodimtsev fell silent, but his expression remained tense. At 35 years old, he was a devoted party man, sent to ensure ideological conformity within the reconnaissance unit. Unlike the hardened veterans around him, his uniform still retained some semblance of proper appearance, and his notebook was always at the ready to record any questionable comments or behaviors. Sergeant Dmitry Volkov, a former hunter from the Ural Mountains with eyes like a hawk, slithered forward. "Comrade Colonel, they've abandoned the truck. The rest of the convoy is moving on without it. 10 men left behind to guard the supplies." Petrov calculated quickly. His unit consisted of 15 men, all experienced in combat. The Germans appeared cold, miserable, and likely hungry themselves. "We wait until nightfall," he decided. "Then we take what we need and perhaps some prisoners for headquarters." The hours passed with excruciating slowness as the temperature continued to drop. The men took turns warming their hands against their bodies, preventing frostbite that could cost them fingers or worse. Throughout the day, they observed the German soldiers making futile attempts to free their truck from the deep snow and ice that had trapped its wheels. As darkness fell, the Germans built a small fire behind the vehicle, seeking whatever meager warmth it provided. "Remember," Petrov instructed his men as they prepared to move, "we need prisoners who can talk, and we need to know what they're transporting. Be precise and quick." The attack was over in less than 3 minutes. Emerging from the darkness like phantoms, Petrov's reconnaissance unit struck with practiced efficiency. 3 Germans died in the initial assault, but the remaining 7 surrendered quickly, their hands raised in the universal gesture of submission. Volkov and 2 others secured the prisoners, while the rest of the unit examined the truck's contents. "Ammunition, fuel, medical supplies," called out Lieutenant Baranov as they catalogued the cargo. "And food, Comrade Colonel, quite a lot of it." Petrov approached the back of the truck where wooden crates had been stacked and partially unloaded. He pried open one with his combat knife, revealing rows of uniform cans packed tightly together. In the dim light of their covered torches, he could make out the English words on the label and an image that appeared to be meat. "American," he said with surprise, turning the can in his gloved hands. "This is American food." Rodimtsev stepped forward, his interest piqued. "How did the fascists get American supplies?" "Perhaps captured from British forces in Africa," suggested Baranov, "or through some neutral country." Petrov handed the can to Volkov, who examined it with curiosity. "Can you open it, Sergeant?" Volkov nodded. using his knife to work the can open. The smell that emerged caused every man present to inhale deeply, a rich, fatty aroma of preserved meat that made their stomachs growl in unison. "What is it?" asked Rodimtsev, leaning closer despite himself. "The label says spam," Petrov replied, recognizing the word from his limited English. "Some kind of meat product." One of the German prisoners, a young corporal who had been watching with hollow eyes, spoke up in broken Russian. "American food, very good. We take from supply depot last month." Petrov turned to the prisoner with renewed interest. "You speak Russian?" The corporal nodded. "Little bit, from Ukraine area before war." "What can you tell me about these supplies? Where did you get them?" The young German hesitated, then seemed to decide that food information wasn't worth dying for. "British convoy, north, many trucks. We captured 2 weeks ago." Petrov considered this information. If the Germans were capturing American supplies intended for Soviet forces, that explained the cans, but it also hinted at a larger supply network he hadn't fully appreciated. "Eat," he told his men, gesturing to the opened can. "We take what we can carry along with the prisoners. The rest we destroy." That night, as they made their way back towards Soviet lines, Petrov's unit experienced something they hadn't known in months, the satisfaction of full stomachs. The American meat product was rich and salty, providing both nutrition and energy that revitalized them despite the bitter cold. Even Rodimtsev had eaten his portion with obvious pleasure, though he maintained that Soviet production would soon create even better rations. 3 days later, having successfully delivered their prisoners and reported on German supply movements, Colonel Petrov found himself summoned to the headquarters of General Vasily Chuikov, commander of the 62nd Army defending Stalingrad. He had included the American rations in his report, but hadn't expected them to warrant special attention amidst the desperate struggle for the city. The headquarters had been established in a partially collapsed factory on the western bank of the Volga River. Inside, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of unwashed bodies. Maps covered every available surface, marked with the constantly changing front lines of the Stalingrad battle. "Our Colonel Petrov," Chuikov greeted him, looking up from a table covered with reports. The general's face was gaunt from weeks of stress and minimal sleep, but his eyes remained sharp and alert. "Your reconnaissance provided valuable intelligence. The German supply routes you identified have already been targeted by our artillery." "Thank you, Comrade General," Petrov replied, standing at attention. "We serve the motherland." "Yes, yes," Chuikov waved a hand dismissively. "But I'm more interested in something specific from your report. You mentioned capturing American food supplies from the Germans." Petrov nodded, somewhat surprised by this focus. "Yes, Comrade General, canned meat labeled as spam. My men consumed some in the field, and we brought back several cans as evidence." "Show me," Chuikov demanded. A staff officer brought forward one of the cans Petrov's unit had recovered. Chuikov turned it in his hands with unusual interest, examining the label and testing the weight. "Do you know what this represents, Colonel?" he asked quietly. "Food supplies intended for us but intercepted by the enemy, Comrade General." Chuikov shook his head. "No, it represents something far more important." He set the can down on his map table. "Come with me. There's someone you need to meet." Curious, Petrov followed Chuikov through several rooms until they entered what appeared to be a supply staging area. Here, to Petrov's astonishment, were stacked hundreds of crates bearing American and British markings. Overseeing the inventory was a civilian man in a rumpled suit who looked distinctly out of place among the military personnel. "Colonel Petrov, this is Boris Sokolov." Chuikov introduced them. "He's our Lend-Lease liaison officer." Sokolov extended his hand, which Petrov shook automatically, still processing the volume of foreign supplies before him. "Colonel Petrov's unit captured some of our spam from the Germans," Chuikov explained to Sokolov. "I thought you might want to explain its significance." Sokolov's tired face broke into a smile. "Ah, the humble spam. Please, Colonel, walk with me." As they moved through the warehouse-like space, Sokolov spoke with unexpected passion about canned meat. "This spam, Colonel, is just one small part of what the Americans are sending us. Since President Roosevelt signed the Lend-Lease Act in March of 1941, their factories have been producing supplies for us in quantities that are difficult to comprehend. I understood that we were receiving some assistance," Petrov acknowledged, but I didn't realize the scale. Few do, Sokolov nodded. The party doesn't emphasize it publicly, but look here, he gestured to different sections of the room. American trucks, American radio equipment, American boots, American flour, American aircraft parts. Last month alone, over 3,000 vehicles came through the Persian corridor. Petrov tried to process these numbers. 3,000 vehicles in 1 month? And that's just through one supply route, Sokolov continued, warming to his subject. The Americans have production capacity beyond anything we've seen. That can of spam you found? They produce millions of them. Millions, Colonel, in factories that have never been bombed, using resources that have never been rationed. The implications began to dawn on Petrov. So while we struggle to produce tanks with factories that have been relocated beyond the Urals, and our people starve, the Americans make enough for themselves and for us, Sokolov finished, and the British and many others. Their factories run 24 hours a day with fresh workers for each shift, all well-fed and working in safety. They stopped before a crate of boots, American-made, leather, with thick rubber soles, unlike anything in standard Soviet issue. Feel the quality, Sokolov invited, handing Petrov a boot. Compare it to what your men are wearing. Petrov held the boot, noting its weight, the careful stitching, the waterproof materials. His own men had been wrapping their feet in rags to supplement their deteriorating footwear. How many of these do they send? He asked quietly. Hundreds of thousands, Sokolov replied, along with uniforms, medical supplies, communications equipment, and the food. Colonel, the food alone has saved countless Soviet lives. Your men enjoyed the spam, did they not? Petrov nodded, remembering the morale boost the rich meal had provided. Now imagine that magnified across the entire Red Army, Sokolov said. American food is feeding our soldiers, while our agricultural production feeds our civilians and essential workers. It's a second front of sorts, a production front that the Germans cannot touch. As they continued their tour, Petrov's understanding of the war began to shift fundamentally. The numbers Sokolov quoted were staggering. Thousands of aircraft, tens of thousands of vehicles, millions of boots, hundreds of millions of rations. The scale of American industrial might made even the impressive Soviet 5-year plan seem modest by comparison. The Germans have nothing comparable, Sokolov explained. They occupy territories, extract resources through force, and struggle to maintain production while we bomb their factories. But the Americans, their homeland is untouched, their factories running at full capacity, their workers well-rested and motivated. When they returned to Chvikov's office, the general was waiting with a glass of vodka for each of them. Now, do you understand, Colonel? He asked, handing Petrov a drink. I'm beginning to, Comrade General, Petrov acknowledged, accepting the rare luxury of alcohol. The fascists may have superior tactical training and initial equipment advantages, Chvikov said, but they cannot match the productive capacity arrayed against them. That can of spam your men found represents an industrial giant that Hitler cannot defeat, no matter how many cities he captures or how many brave Soviet soldiers he kills. Rodimtsev, the political officer who had accompanied Petrov to headquarters, shifted uncomfortably. Surely, Comrade General, it is the heroism and sacrifice of the Soviet people that will secure our victory. Chvikov fixed Rodimtsev with a penetrating stare. Of course, Comrade Commissar. Our people's sacrifice is the foundation of everything. But even heroism needs bullets, and courage needs boots. The Americans are providing both in quantities that will drown the fascists in material. 2 days later, Petrov found himself in an even more surprising location, aboard a British transport aircraft flying to Moscow. General Chvikov had ordered him to accompany Sokolov to a high-level meeting regarding Lend-Lease coordination. His first-hand experience with captured American supplies made him a valuable witness to how the supply chain was functioning, or in some cases, failing. The flight gave Petrov his first opportunity to see the war from above. The devastation of the Soviet landscape was apparent even from the air. Burned villages, cratered roads, forests reduced to splinters by artillery. But as they approached Moscow, he was struck by something else. The vast number of trains moving eastward from the capital, carrying supplies to the front lines. Most of those trains carry American equipment, Sokolov told him, noting his interest in the view. "The logistics are impressive, aren't they?" Moscow itself showed the scars of German bombing raids, but the city was functioning with surprising efficiency. Petrov had expected greater destruction after the battles of 1941, but the capital's recovery was evident. As their car drove through the streets toward the Kremlin, he observed civilians going about their business with determination, if not normalcy. The meeting took place in a conference room deep within the government complex. Petrov was shocked to find himself in the presence of not only Soviet military leadership, but also several Americans and British officials. As a colonel from the front, he felt distinctly out of place among the generals, diplomats, and ministers. An American general named Bradley was speaking as they entered, pointing to production figures on a large chart. He paused briefly as they found seats, then continued in English, which was translated by an interpreter. "As you can see, gentlemen, our shipments of trucks will increase by 15% next month. President Roosevelt has authorized additional production lines specifically for Soviet requirements." The Soviet representatives nodded approvingly, making notes. Petrov studied the Americans with fascination. Their uniforms were immaculate, their faces full and healthy, their manner confident without arrogance. They showed none of the strain that marked every Soviet officer he knew, no hollow eyes from sleepless nights, no gauntness from missed meals, no nervous tics from constant artillery bombardment. These men, he realized, were fighting the same war, but experiencing it entirely differently. As the meeting progressed, Petrov was occasionally asked to comment on conditions at the front and the performance of American equipment. He spoke truthfully about the desperate fighting in Stalingrad, the critical shortages they faced, and how the captured Spam had briefly elevated his men's morale and fighting capacity. "A single can of meat made that much difference?" asked one of the American colonels, seeming surprised. "When men have been surviving on bread and whatever they can scavenge, Comrade Colonel." "Yes," Petrov replied. "It was not just the nutrition, but what it represented. Abundance beyond what we have known for years." The American nodded thoughtfully. "We'll increase food shipments immediately. Our farmers are producing record harvests this year." After the formal meeting concluded, Petrov found himself invited to a smaller gathering in what appeared to be a diplomat's residence. Here, in a setting more relaxed than the Kremlin conference room, Soviet and Allied officers spoke more freely, facilitated by several bottles of vodka and American whiskey. The American colonel who had inquired about the Spam introduced himself as Thomas Williams from the Supply Corps. "I'm responsible for ensuring our food shipments meet your specifications," he explained. "Your feedback is invaluable." Petrov, somewhat uncomfortable in this social setting, nevertheless recognized the importance of honest communication. "Your canned meat saved my men from hunger and gave them strength during a critical mission," he said. "But if I may speak frankly—" "Please do," Williams encouraged. "The delivery systems are problematic. We found your excellent supplies in German hands. They had captured them from a British convoy. This happens frequently." Williams sighed. "The Arctic convoy route is treacherous. We lose many ships to U-boats and the Luftwaffe, but we're developing better systems. The Persian corridor is proving more reliable, and the Alaska-Siberia air route for aircraft delivery is expanding." Petrov considered this information. "The scale of what you're attempting is difficult for me to comprehend." "It's unprecedented," Williams acknowledged. "But American industry was built for exactly this kind of challenge. When our factories retooled for war production, they did so with efficiency that surprised even us. A factory making refrigerators 1 month was producing aircraft parts the next." "And your workers?" Petrov asked. "How do they maintain such output?" "Good wages, excellent food, and knowing their work saves lives," Williams replied simply. "Many have sons or brothers in uniform. They understand the stakes." Across the room, Petrov noticed Sokolov deep in conversation with a British officer. The Lend-Lease liaison caught his eye and gestured him over. "Colonel, you must hear this," Sokolov said as Petrov approached. "Major Thompson has been explaining British aluminum production figures." The British officer nodded. "As I was telling your colleague, our factories produced enough aluminum last year for 22,000 aircraft. Combined with American production, The Allied powers manufactured over 100,000 aircraft in 1942 alone. Petrov struggled to keep his expression neutral. The entire Soviet Air Force had fewer planes than what the British and Americans were producing in a single year, and they were sharing significant numbers with the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease. "That's more aircraft than Germany can produce in 3 years," Major Thompson continued. "And that's just one category of war material." Later that evening, back in his assigned quarters, Petrov sat at a small desk, writing notes on everything he had learned. The implications were too significant to trust to memory alone. The meeting had transformed his understanding of the war and the forces truly shaping its outcome. Soviet propaganda had always emphasized the heroism of the Red Army and the productivity of Soviet workers, with Allied assistance mentioned only in passing. Now he understood that this assistance represented an industrial tidal wave that would eventually drown the Axis powers in material superiority. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. He opened it to find Sokolov, looking even more rumpled than usual. "May I come in, Colonel? There's something I need to show you." Petrov stepped aside, allowing the Lend-Lease liaison to enter. Sokolov carried a leather briefcase which he placed on the desk. "What I'm about to share with you is classified," Sokolov said, his voice low despite the privacy of the room. "But given your new role in our Lend-Lease coordination, you need to understand the full picture." From the briefcase he removed several folders containing production figures, shipping manifests, and statistical analyses. As Petrov reviewed them, the true scale of American aid became even clearer. According to these reports, American Lend-Lease accounts for... Petrov paused, recalculating the percentages to ensure he hadn't misunderstood. "Approximately 400,000 vehicles, including 150,000 trucks," Sokolov confirmed. "Nearly 15 million pairs of boots, 2 million tons of food. Enough aluminum and steel to build our own factories, telephone wire that could circle the globe several times over." Petrov looked up from the documents. "These numbers can't be correct." "They are," Sokolov insisted, "and they're increasing monthly. By 1945, American production will reach levels that were unimaginable before the war." "Does Stalin know the full extent of this aid?" Petrov asked cautiously. Sokolov nodded. "Of course, the State Planning Committee provides him with detailed reports, but publicly, we maintain the narrative that Soviet production and sacrifice are the primary factors in our resistance." "For morale," Petrov suggested. "For morale," Sokolov agreed, "and for politics after the war. But the reality, Colonel, is that American spam is just the visible tip of an industrial iceberg. The Germans are fighting not just the Soviet Union, but the factories of Detroit, the steel mills of Pittsburgh, the assembly lines that stretch from California to New York." After Sokolov left, Petrov returned to his notes with a new perspective. The small can of meat his men had discovered in a German truck was indeed far more significant than they could have imagined, a symbol of a production capacity so vast it would ultimately determine the outcome of the war. 5 days later, Colonel Petrov returned to Stalingrad with orders to implement new distribution protocols for Lend-Lease supplies. The bitter fighting continued in the ruined city, but the Soviet noose around the German Sixth Army was tightening. Operation Uranus, the massive Soviet counteroffensive, had just begun, with columns of T-34 tanks, many running on American fuel, their crews fed with American rations, sweeping around the German flanks. The unit he had led on reconnaissance was now back in the line, holding a section of rubble that had once been a factory complex. Lieutenant Baranov greeted him with surprise and relief. "Comrade Colonel, we thought you had been reassigned permanently to Moscow." "Not yet," Petrov replied, surveying the position. Despite the ongoing battle, he noticed something different about his men. They looked healthier. Their uniforms had been supplemented with new items, and their weapons gleamed with proper maintenance. "You've received new supplies?" Baranov nodded enthusiastically. "Yes, Comrade Colonel. American boots for everyone, and look," he produced a small metal object from his pocket. "Personal can openers for the rations." Petrov took the can opener, a simple device known as a P-38 by the Americans. It was small enough to fit on a dog tag chain, but sturdy enough to open any standard ration can. And the rations themselves? He asked. Much improved, Baranov confirmed. American canned meat twice weekly. Their flour makes better bread than what we had before. And chocolate. Some of the men had never tasted it. Sergeant Volkov approached, saluting. The hunter's keen eyes noted the changes in his commander. Moscow has treated you well, Comrade Colonel? Moscow has been educational, Petrov replied carefully. Where is Comrade Commissar Rudimtsev? Reassigned, Volkov said with a slight smile. After your departure, he made some comments about over-reliance on capitalist supplies. The political department felt he needed additional ideological training. Petrov suppressed his own smile. The military pragmatists were evidently winning some battles against the ideological purists, at least when it came to accepting Allied assistance. That evening, as artillery pounded the German positions and the sky glowed orange from fires throughout the city, Petrov gathered his officers for a briefing. He had been authorized to share certain information about Lend-Lease supplies to improve morale and ensure proper utilization. Comrades, he began, what I am about to tell you may change your understanding of our situation. 5 weeks ago, we captured a truck containing American spam. What we didn't realize then was what that simple can of meat represented. For the next hour, he explained the scale of Allied production and how it was reshaping the war. He told them about American factories producing a bomber every hour, about shipyards launching Liberty ships faster than U-boats could sink them, about endless trains of supplies moving across Siberia toward the front. The fascists started this war with superior equipment and tactics, he concluded, but they failed to account for American productive capacity. Each month, this advantage grows. The spam you enjoyed was manufactured alongside millions of identical cans. The boots you now wear came from factories producing hundreds of thousands of pairs monthly. The Germans have no equivalent source of supply. Lieutenant Baranov, who had been listening intently, raised a hand. Comrade Colonel, are you saying the Americans will win this war for us? Petrov shook his head firmly. No, Lieutenant. We will win this war with our blood, our courage, and our sacrifice. Nothing can replace what the Soviet people have given and will continue to give. He paused, choosing his words carefully. But we will win it wearing American boots, communicating with American radios, driving American trucks, and yes, eating American spam. The production capacity of our allies ensures that no matter how many factories the Germans destroy, no matter how many of our tanks they disable, we will always have more. The officers exchanged glances, absorbing this new perspective. Sergeant Volkov, practical as always, was the first to respond. So the Nazis are not just fighting us, but the factories of America as well? Exactly, Petrov confirmed. And those factories cannot be bombed, their workers cannot be killed, their resources cannot be depleted. For every tank we lose, American steel makes another possible. For every radio destroyed, American factories ship replacements. Later that night, as Petrov made his rounds of the positions, he found Volkov sharing American chocolate with a group of young replacements who had just arrived from training centers in the Urals. The sergeant was explaining something that made the newcomer's eyes widen. "What are you telling them, Sergeant?" Petrov inquired. "About the Americans, Comrade Colonel," Volkov replied. "I was explaining that for every chocolate bar we receive, they produce thousands. That for every radio we use, they make hundreds. That their trucks come from factories larger than entire Soviet cities." One of the young soldiers looked up at Petrov. "Is it true, Comrade Colonel, that the Americans can produce a tank in a single day?" "Less than a day, actually," Petrov confirmed. "Their factories assemble them on moving lines, with each worker performing one specific task as the tank moves past them." Another young soldier, barely old enough to shave, shook his head in wonder. "And they're on our side?" "They are," Petrov nodded, "which means that time is on our side as well. Each day the war continues, Allied production increases, while German resources diminish." As winter deepened and the battle for Stalingrad reached its climax, Petrov observed the changing tide not just in the tactical situation, but in the material condition of Soviet forces. New equipment arrived regularly: communications gear, medical supplies, vehicles, and of course food. The improvements were incremental but cumulative, building toward an undeniable advantage. By January 1943, When Field Marshal Paulus surrendered the remnants of the once mighty Sixth Army, Petrov understood that they were witnessing not just a Soviet victory, but the inevitable consequence of production disparities that would define the remainder of the war. On the day the last German troops surrendered in Stalingrad, Petrov found himself standing in the ruins with Lieutenant Baranov, surveying the devastated city that had become a symbol of Soviet resistance. "It's difficult to imagine this place ever being rebuilt," Baranov commented, looking at the shattered buildings stretching to the horizon. "It will be rebuilt," Petrov assured him, "just as our armies will be re-equipped, our people fed, our nation restored." He reached into his pocket and produced a small object, the P-38 can opener he had kept as a reminder. "This little tool opened more than just cans of Spam, Lieutenant. It opened my eyes to the true nature of modern war." Baranov looked at the simple device, then back at his commander. "Production." "Production," Petrov confirmed. "The Germans gambled everything on a quick victory because they knew they couldn't match Allied industrial output in a prolonged conflict. They lost that gamble at Moscow in '41, and now they've lost irreplaceable forces here at Stalingrad. From this point forward, the material advantage shifts increasingly in our favor." He handed the can opener to Baranov. "Keep this. Someday when your grandchildren ask you how we defeated the fascists, show them this and tell them about American Spam and what it really meant." In the months and years that followed, as the Soviet armies pushed westward toward Berlin, Petrov's understanding was confirmed repeatedly. American trucks carried Soviet troops on the offensive. American radios coordinated their movements. American food sustained them through the long campaigns. The material superiority became more pronounced with each passing month, eventually overwhelming German resistance, despite their tactical skill and desperate courage. By April 1945, as Soviet forces fought through the outskirts of Berlin, Colonel, now General, Mikhail Petrov commanded a tank division equipped with a mixture of Soviet and American vehicles. The headquarters where he planned operations included American telephones, American typewriters, and American maps. His personal staff ate American rations, wore American boots, and used American medical supplies. On the day Berlin fell, as the red flag was raised over the Reichstag, Petrov stood in the ruined German capital and reflected on the journey that had begun with a simple can of meat outside Stalingrad. The heroism of Soviet soldiers had been essential. Nothing could replace the courage and sacrifice of the men and women who had fought across 2,000 miles from Stalingrad to Berlin. But equally essential had been the Spam, the boots, the trucks, the radios, the aluminum, and all the other products of American factories that had poured into the Soviet Union in a torrent of industrial might. In his pocket, Petrov carried a small notebook where he had recorded the statistics that still astonished him. Over $11 billion in Lend-Lease aid, more than 400,000 vehicles, 14,000 aircraft, tens of millions of rations, enough telephone wire to reach the moon and back. The scope was too vast for any single person to fully comprehend. But it had begun, for him at least, with a single can of Spam that revealed an industrial gulf the Germans could never bridge. Years after the war, long after Lend-Lease had ended and the Cold War had begun, Petrov would still occasionally mention the Spam to his family and close friends. Most Soviet citizens never knew the full extent of American aid. Official histories downplayed it, focusing instead on Soviet heroism and production. But Petrov, who had seen the manifests, visited the warehouses, and witnessed the transformation of the Red Army through Allied supplies, never forgot. "The war was won by Soviet blood and American factories," he would say quietly. "We paid the higher price, but we could not have paid it without their production." And that single can of Spam, captured from a German truck in the snow outside Stalingrad, had been his first glimpse of the industrial might that would ultimately determine the outcome of the greatest conflict in human history. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.